They didn't call my name. I stood in the back of the auditorium near the doors where latecomers and strangers usually hover. The seats were filled, the lights dimmed, and all eyes were on the stage. Eli was front and centre, crisp in uniform posture. Perfect. He looked proud. Proud enough for both of us. Our parents were there, of course. Colonel Richard Avery, retired Air Force, a man whose silence could freeze a room. Beside him, my mother Elaine, former Navy nurse, pressed a tissue to her lip. Their youngest son was becoming a SEAL. Their pride was spotless intact. We were a military family through and through. Expectations came in ranks and ribbons. Eli was the golden boy, quiet, disciplined, predictable. I had always been louder, sharper at the edges. They called it defiance. I called it clarity. When they started reading the list of family members to be acknowledged, I already knew what was coming. Mr. and Mrs. Avery, Lieutenant Mark Avery, Miss Danielle Avery. I clapped like everyone else. No pause, no expression, just steady applause. No one looked my way. No one noticed the name missing. Not even Eli. People think I dropped out, that I cracked under pressure and walked away from the academy in my junior year. There's a version of the story where I gave up, couldn't hack it, and went off to figure things out. At some point, someone must have told my mother I work as a delivery driver now. She seemed to like that version. It gave her something simple to say when people asked. She's doing shipping now, I heard her once say, in that practiced tone that makes a lie sound like mercy. No one asked for the truth. And the truth was this: I didn't quit. I was recruited. I serve somewhere else now, under different orders in a different chain of command. No name tag, no public record. I lead a unit where no one uses real names, and even my colleagues only know me by call sign. I've held ranks higher than my brother will probably ever touch, but no one here would believe that. They're not supposed to. My name is Samantha Avery. I'm a colonel in the United States Air Force, assigned to operations so classified, even my unit doesn't know my full name. I've coordinated cross-border rescues, intercepted arms deals on 3 continents, and stood in briefing rooms where every word was stamped, eyes only. I hold clearance above generals. At home, I'm the daughter who couldn't handle the academy, the sister who dropped out and now does delivery gigs according to the version my mother prefers. My father hasn't looked me in the eye in years. My brother invites me to ceremonies out of pity or habit. I don't correct them, because being invisible to them is the only way I get to protect the things they'll never understand. But sometimes, like today at my brother's ceremony, it hits harder than I expect. A few rows ahead, a young woman in a navy blue dress wiped tears from her eyes when her husband's name was called. She held his hand tightly as he walked across the stage. I felt something tighten in my chest, not jealousy. Just the reminder that I'd never be named like that. Not in family gatherings, not in uniform ceremonies, not anywhere. Will I always be the outsider, I thought. Even in the world I gave everything for the camera, swept across the crowd. I didn't even think, I just dipped my head, let my hair fall forward. Reflex, old training. Don't be seen, don't be traced, don't exist. Eli stood tall on the stage. They pinned the SEAL trident on his chest. The auditorium roared with applause. Somewhere in the noise, my mother's voice cracked with pride. I didn't cry, I didn't smile, I just stood there and clapped like any other stranger in the room. They thought I disappeared, but I never left. And before I tell you what really happened, before I explain how I ended up here invisible, even to my own blood, let me take you back to the day everything changed. It started with a knock on my dorm room door junior year, and a file I never touched. The morning air was still thick with fog when I opened the door. It was Eli wearing his navy sweatshirt, forcing a smile. "Hey, Sam," he said, voice casual. "Can I borrow your key? I forgot my notes for cryptography class." I nodded without thinking. Brotherly courtesy, nothing more. Moments later, footsteps receded down the hallway. I chalked it up to sibling forgetfulness and went back to rehearsing my briefing assignment for strategy class. That was the last thing I expected to matter. An hour passed before the knock came again, louder this time. This wasn't Eli. The woman on the other side wore a crisp navy uniform and carried a sealed envelope. She introduced herself as the Academy's security officer. Without explanation, she handed me the envelope and motioned me to follow. That was when suspicion flickered. Never smoke without fire. Her office was spare navy blue walls, a single desk and a dip in the carpet where chairs had worn tracks. She slid the envelope across the desk. Inside, a printed memorandum outlining sanctions for unauthorized possession of classified cryptographic materials. My name was there, bold and official. Worse, the list included dates, times, and file names. One file in particular, code sheet Omega-7, classified, do not remove. But I hadn't touched it. I didn't even know it existed. They accused me of violating security protocols. I asked for clarification. They showed me logs my thumbprint on a secured terminal access cred, anonymously issued access times that happened while I was in class. They didn't say it was sabotage, just that rules were rules. In that moment, I had only two choices: fight and let them dig until they found the truth, or accept and protect whatever lay beyond the dismissal. I chose the latter. I didn't mention Eli's key or his visit. I didn't explain the knock at the door early that morning. I didn't ask for time or evidence. I merely packed 2 bags, the full uniform, a civilian outfit, and my notebooks, and walked out of the academy. No fanfare, no message home. Just an exit stamp that read, "Suspended indefinitely pending investigation." My roommate Laura cornered me in the hallway afterward. She pressed me. "Something's off," she said. "Access logs don't lie." I shrugged and told her I'd deal with it later. She pressed harder. "Maybe check your room, Sam." Panic flared. I shoved her off, not because I was mad, but because I believed her. I had to believe her. But I didn't open the USB drive I'd found on my desk later that night. I didn't tell anyone what it contained. I filed it away just in case. They withdrew my scholarship. Failed to meet conduct expectations, they said. The letter arrived just before midnight, its tone sterile and final, like a judge's gavel echoing in an empty courtroom. My parents received a carbon copy, no call, no meeting. Just paper. My mother wrote back offering a consolation that arrived 3 weeks later. Maybe something in shipping or logistics, dear? Love, Mum. Eli texted me once, "Sorry about everything. I'll visit soon." I didn't reply. Not because I was angry. I was broken. I believed I'd let them down even though I hadn't. I believed I deserved this. I left town at dawn the next day. My bags were lighter, so was my heart. I became a ghost in my own life. Jobs came and went, moving boxes, delivering packages, waiting tables, but each one allowed me to blend in. Each one kept me from digging deeper into myself, into the academy, into Eli. But they couldn't keep me from learning. Because while I was making deliveries, someone was watching. They tracked my discipline, my habits, my ability to stay silent. When the knock came again, months later, it was at a place with fewer cameras and no uniforms. This time, the official at the door wore plain clothes and an air of certainty. "We need someone who can make hard calls," they said, "someone who doesn't need recognition, someone who knows when to disappear." They gave me a folder stamped with a red seal, "Special access required." I didn't have to think. I answered, yes. 6 months later, I walked into a briefing room under a different name, taking command of an operation I couldn't describe. I signed orders that bypassed congressional oversight. I filed reports labelled "Eyes Only." Internally, they called me Shadow Colonel. Externally, they built stories to explain my absence. At home, the Avery family rumour mill churned about the daughter who vanished, ran off to join some private logistics company. At every SEAL ceremony, my name stayed off the guest list. My secret, it kept me alive, and it protected more than just me. But then, that morning came. I was summoned to the Academy's security office. I recognised the feeling, the same rush of ice that had flooded me years ago when I first saw that file I never touched. Walking down the hall, I clutched my badge without realising it. My heart didn't skip. It just locked down. Inside, they didn't waste time. We discovered unauthorised materials in your personal locker. The lead officer, stern grey uniformed nameless, said, gesturing toward a laptop and a stack of papers. They were marked Top Secret, Crypto Level 3, Do Not Remove. The folder bore the Academy seal. I looked at my hands. I didn't touch it. I didn't know it existed. My voice stayed firm. I don't know how that got there. No one spoke for a moment. Then, a second officer, softer voiced, added, "We treat any possession of crypto-level documents as a security breach. You're suspended pending internal investigation. Your scholarship is on hold." My father's voice echoed in my head, silent, disapproving silence. I imagined his eyes cold as steel. My mother's clipped reply, "At least we still have Eli." Eli was there too, hovering at the edge of the room. His posture was impeccable, but his eyes flickered uncertain. Distant, I recognised that look. He looked at me like I was someone else's problem. I didn't reach for him. Somewhere in the back, my roommate Laura, who'd warned me weeks ago, watched with concern. There was no outcry. No one jumped to my defence. I said nothing. I had no proof. Even if I did, I couldn't show it. Late that afternoon, I packed my things. Under the dim dorm light, I found the old photo Eli and me on our first day at the academy. He grinned me too, both hopeful in starched uniforms. I slipped it into my pocket. I couldn't bring it to graduation. Maybe I'd keep it forever. The security officer returned with a form, an anonymous security agreement. It required signing away any public claim to appeal or redemption. I could request full clearance and return within 6 months once the incident was closed. Or I could volunteer for placement into a discrete operations program. My choice would determine my future. The words hit me disappear from the academy records, but step into something else, something real. I looked up at the nameless officer. I paused and met his eyes. My voice was steady. "I'll sign," I said, "and I'll volunteer." The signature felt final. No public reinstatement, no awards, no goodbye ceremony. My name vanished from the list of cadets. My scholarship went on hold. My family might assume I dropped out, but they'd never know how I vanished on purpose. Laura knocked twice. "You okay?" she asked quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. She left a note. "Stay safe. Trust yourself." That night, I slipped out through a side door. No goodbyes, no acceptance speech. Just me, a duffel bag, and a new purpose. A few days later, I received an encrypted file details of operations assignments and training schedules. I reported to a secure location, far from campus walls, where my uniform changed and my identity narrowed. Eli texted, "Call me when you can." I didn't. I disappeared again. Weeks turned into months. I still cleaned lockers occasionally under contractors' guise, but mostly I trained intense physicals intelligence protocols, covert communication cryptography. I learned to mask my patterns, to erase my presence, to become exactly what they needed, invisible but essential. During one training exercise, I intercepted a mock signal on a satellite feed. I decrypted it faster than anyone expected. One of the directors whispered, "That's a level above what we planned. She's natural." It wasn't natural, it was who I became. Every now and then, I received a file labelled "Family Updates." Someone snuck me wedding photos, Eli and his seal whites, smiling at their parents. Another file was a newspaper clipping, "Samantha Avery missing, presumed dropped out." I never opened those. My assignments began to cross national borders. I coordinated evacuations, shut down illegal comms, secured assets, all under code names and clearance walls. My family would never know. They didn't need to. because they already turned their backs. Now, years later, I stand here, Colonel Samantha Avery, with medals they'll never see, missions they'll never hear of. I protect them from shadows they'll never understand, and for that, I stay invisible. In New Mexico, beneath endless high desert skies, I began training in a classified facility known only by coordinates. It wasn't a base, it was a vault. Outside, the world was normal. Inside, it wasn't. No name tags, no phones, no personal backgrounds. They drilled that home on day one. You are S12. Not Samantha Avery, not Colonel Avery. A call sign, nothing more. Silence became my uniform. Even questions were monitored. No one asked, "Where are you from?" or "Who's your family?" We answered to scenarios, not to backstories. Emotion was a liability. Physical tests came first, grueling runs, mock extractions, rappelling into simulated zones. I kept pace, no missteps. But the real trial lay deeper: mental conditioning. They threw us into chaos simulations, intelligence leaks, civilian layers, gut-wrenching unpredictability. You had to stay sharp while drowning in noise. On day 10, I faced the first psychological screening. They sat me in a dim room, lights low, and fed me imagery from home images. I thought I'd buried my father's unread letter, my mother's coded pity, Eli's clean-eyed pity. My heart clenched. I refused hydration. My breathing faltered. When they asked, "Are you stable?" I stared into their eyes, thought of every time I'd let them assume I'd failed. I broke. Panic tears. One moment of weakness in 3 years of training. They pulled me out. The facility doctor spoke later. Not everyone rebounds from betrayal. The mind fractures even when the body stands. I refused to explain. They recorded it, filed it under adjustable. Late that night, back in the bunks, I lay awake. The bunk lighting dimmed. Sleep sounded easier. Then I heard someone shift beside me, call sign S17, a quiet operator with just 2 deployments under her belt. "Hey," she said softly, "don't try to make them understand. Make things they can't ignore." That phrase lodged itself in my mind like a mission objective. Not explanation. Impact. From that night, I shifted. I stopped trying to reclaim my past. I focused on what I could control, solving intel puzzles, mastering covert tradecraft stealth communications. I stopped looking for empathy, started aiming for results. Weeks later, they ran us through a joint simulation with explosives codes and snipers. The room waited for me to crack. Instead, I directed entry protocols, ordered flank maneuvers, flagged intel inconsistencies. Operatives around me gave silent nods. We passed, with distinction. In New Mexico's dusty barracks among operators who only knew me as S12, I found purpose. Not validation, purpose. But at night, I still dreamt of home, of Eli's grin at every SEAL gala, of my mother's rehearsed smiles, of the ignored chair in the back row. Guilt mingled with resolve. I fell asleep, promising one day they'll see the results of what I do. Training shifted to fieldcraft isolated drops, recon runs, satellite-extracted ops. I learned to vanish in plain sight, to breathe without sound, to process data with surgical precision. They called me Ghost with impact. They didn't know I used to need applause. When one instructor asked why I stayed silent, I answered, "'Cause when they know too much, they get in the way." Another said, "You're here to change outcomes, not opinions." I kept my head down, let my success speak through mission debriefs. Each nod from senior staff echoed the code I lived by: impact above everything. By week 12, recruiters visited the compound. They passed out name badges and project IDs, confirming job assignments inside Black Ops divisions. I scanned thinner groups of trainees until I saw S12 stamped next to Team Lead Recon Ops. My call sign became less invisible. The room respected it. Not Samantha Avery, not the dropout. S12 leader. My chest tightened not from pride but from release. I was somewhere that knew what I did, knew why I left everything behind, but there was no celebrating. A secure file arrived, family update. We continue to operate under natural causes narrative. Another message, Eli Avery promoted to lieutenant commander today. Closed files, quiet lives. Yet something shifted inside me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was rising. The night still brought longing, but I traded pain for purpose. I took each mission as proof, not for them, but for myself. Each decrypted signal, successful exfil, covert extraction evidence I was more than their assumptions. In the desert, under vigil of satellite and star, I forged a new identity. Not erased, upgraded. Soon I'd walk out again. Not back to the auditorium, but to a world that needed me. And maybe then echoes of impact might travel across walls I thought were solid. My first return home after the New Mexico training felt like stepping into someone else's life. The front door swung open, and there they were, my family. Quiet, polite, rehearsed. My father, Colonel Richard Avery, stood ramrod straight, but didn't meet my eyes. My mother, Elaine, smiled softly, but her shoulders trembled as she mentioned Eli's new assignment, moving closer to a base that didn't require her to attend my celebrations. I nodded, offering a polite smile while the words, "Congratulations, Eli," echoed in my mind as if uttered for my benefit. Dinner was the familiar drill pasta salad, the same stories retold. Then the question slipped in soft knowing. My aunt asked, "So are you still delivering packages, Samantha?" There was a pause as everyone waited for my denial, my explanation. I took a breath and only nodded. Silence reigned. In that moment, I became invisible again. I accepted the lukewarm food, a foil-wrapped slice placed at the end of the table, as if it were enough. My mother placed the cold pizza in front of me without meeting my gaze. I brushed my fingers over the sharp pizza crust and wondered if consistency hurt less than attention. Eli sat next to her receiving the fresh hot slice. He caught me looking and offered a half smile that faded before it reached his eyes. 2 weeks later, miles away in North Africa, I found clarity under a different sky. A Sikorsky helicopter thumped above the desert scrub dust swirling beneath us. Inside, my team double-checked equipment chest rigs, radio sidearms. I strapped in last, the weight of authority heavy on my shoulders. I tapped my throat mic and spoke calmly, Team X position secure. Shipper has completed the delivery. Shipper was code for me. It connected my present to my past in a jolt of irony, but this time the delivery was interception of weapons intended for conflict. No fanfare. No cameras, just disciplined action in hostile terrain. We touched down. The air smelled of heat and tension. Local forces awaited us, older soldiers stepping down from dusty trucks. Among them, a small girl appeared. She approached me cautiously and held out a hand-wash scarf embroidered with a faded name, probably her sister's. Her eyes were hopeful. I knelt low, took the scarf and whispered, "Shukran." Her face broke in a shy grin, and I realized it was the first time I felt truly seen in years. Not Samantha Avery, civilian dropout. Not Colonel Avery, military enigma. Just a human to do the right thing. That image stayed with me through nightly missions. Briefings by night insertion at dawn intel gathering under moonlight strategic withdrawals before the desert sun. We liberated hostages, shut down networks without drawing attention, and secured routes for aid convoys. No medals, no headlines, just whispered acknowledgements over secure channels. Each success buffered the ache I carried. When I returned home again, I carried that scarf in my duffel. It was folded neatly, its scent still earthy. I put it around my neck before dinner, an unspoken challenge to join their world and claim my own. My mother gasped softly when she saw it. My cousin's silverware froze mid-air. Eli's head snapped up, then he looked away conflicted. He didn't ask why I had it or what it meant. I didn't offer. Dinner played out again in silence. Eli took the first bite of lasagna. I waited, paced my hands over the scarf-rimmed collar, then slipped away quietly. No goodbyes, no speeches, just me and a suitcase of secrets catching the overnight flight back to operations. That night, in a Spartan barracks bed, I pulled the scarf over my heart and closed my eyes. I thought of my father's silent disapproval and my mother's practiced concern. I thought of Eli's frozen expression when he saw the scarf. My heart hurt, but not for reasons I expected it hurt. From the reminder that, while I am invisible to them, I remain vivid where it counts. When morning came, I tucked the scarf into the front pocket of my shirt before mission briefing. I emerged again in dust and dusk, forging ahead under satellite-eyed skies. With each runway takeoff and each target, secured the echo of impact from my past, shattered the invisible walls around my identity. By the end of that rotation, I had compiled reports, broken trafficking cells, safe passages for civilians, routes predicted before first intel loops fed in. My team member S-17 handed me a sip of water after a 12-hour turret watch and said, "You're making ripples, shipper." We laughed quietly. It wasn't mockery, it was respect. This isn't the life they know. Back home, they still share rumours Samantha left. She's off somewhere, but out here in the field, I'm no rumour. I am present, I matter. That scarf rests now on my desk next to a classified mission map. It reminds me acknowledgement doesn't always come from home. Sometimes it comes from the people you save on the other side of the world. Then, one afternoon, in my operations office, a secured windowless room humming with servers and satellite uplinks, I found an envelope slipped under the door. No protocol had flagged it. My instincts told me it wasn't routine. The handwriting was familiar, neat, upright, undeniably Eli's. "Sam," it began, "I'm honoured to invite you to my SEAL ceremony in Coronado. I understand if you'd prefer not to attend, but if you see it fitting, I'd be glad to have you there. Love, Eli. 7 years since I had heard his voice in any meaningful way. 7 years since a string of silence separated me from family dinners, holidays, graduations. 7 years of landing in dusty villages, solving problems they'll never know about." My finger trembled over the paper. I folded it methodically and unfolded it. I stared at the words, "if you see it fitting." No pressure, no praise, no expectations. Just an opening my name included for once. That night, a storm rolled over the base. Thunder rattled the roof and the power cycled. I lay on my fold-out bunk bed, the envelope on my chest heart, pounding like a dropped chopper. I had thrown it away once when I found it. Then I retrieved it late at night. Then I tucked it under my blanket to hide from myself. Now the storm had an edge of reckoning. I closed my eyes and thought, do I still belong there? By morning, I'd submitted a leave request, 24 hours personal time. No explanation. I packed a single bag, uniform dress, blue civilian clothes, and tucked inside a hidden pocket, I placed the replica of the Level 3 cryptography file from that junior year scandal. It had been authenticated by the agency months ago, now stamped exculpatory document cleared for eyes only. It was my proof, my defence, my silent shield if I chose to deploy it. But I carried it hidden, because unveiling it would shatter everything. The operation, the security, the silence. I told my chain of command it was a personal matter. They approved. No further questions. Flight to San Diego was quiet. I watched the coastline roll past waves meeting rocks, both relentless. I thought of Eli's path, SEAL training deployments medals followed by mine, unseen but no less vital. If I walked into that ceremony, I walked into their world again. But would they still see me? That night in the barracks hotel, I unpacked the file and the letter. I sat both on the desk, breathing in elevator stillness. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I stared at the ceiling shadows cast by the lamp, imagining the ceremony hall, Stage-lit cameras, ready banners waving. My name would not be read. My rank never announced. But the file in my pocket held the truth. I whispered into the dark, do I still have a place at that table? I pictured the first chairs reserved for family. Would mine be there? Would eyes glance past me? Would the air feel heavy with 1,000 unasked questions? At 2 a.m, I walked to the window. The city light stretched below civilian life, untouched by covert missions. Somewhere in that grid of streets and homes, my parents slept unaware I had returned. Eli was probably already there, nervous, practicing his salute, waiting to be recognised. I thought of the scarf from Africa, the missions in silence, the nods from teammates. Recognition wasn't a badge or a sound, it was a knowing glance. I had that. Now I wondered, could I carry it into this light-filled room again? I looked back at the invitation. I touched the inked script. I took the file and slid it back into the pocket. I closed both items, tucked them into my bag, and lay down flat. I didn't sleep, but I felt resolved. Because tomorrow I'd walk in, not as a ghost, not as a stranger, but as someone who never left for reasons they may never understand, but which I had lived by. And so I did. The auditorium was bright that morning, filled with crisp uniforms and civilian pride. Rows of families clutched programs, and flowers glancing around for glimpses of their sons and daughters soon to be SEALs. There were no banners, no music, just reverence ritual and recognition. I arrived early by habit, more than choice. I chose a seat near the back, out of spotlight range, but close enough to see the stage. My hand stayed on my lap, resting on the fabric of a plain black coat. No insignia, no rank, just enough to pass for someone who belonged, though no one expected me to. That's when I saw him. General Langford stood near the far side of the stage, his posture impeccable. He wasn't on the official speaker list, but generals rarely needed invitations. When our eyes met, it was instantaneous. His jaw tightened for a half second, then he nodded, barely visible, but full of weight. It wasn't surprise on his face. It was memory. He had read my file the week everything fell apart. He was part of the internal review that never made it to public record. He signed the clearance that allowed me to disappear. Now, he saw me again. Not buried in a report, not on a screen, but there, in the flesh, in a seat I wasn't supposed to occupy. His eyes softened just for a moment. Then he looked away. I kept my posture relaxed, but my pulse spiked. When the ceremony began, names were read slowly. Cadets approached the stage, were handed their tridents, and saluted the commanding officers. Eli's name came 2/3 in. My parents clapped hard, my mother dabbing at her eyes. Eli looked sharp, steady, ready. Langford approached the podium. Before we conclude, he said, adjusting the mic, there's someone here today I didn't expect to see. A familiar face, though not one many of you would recognise. I froze. He turned slightly toward the crowd, eyes scanning. Colonel Avery, he said, voice even. Didn't think I'd see you among civilians. The air in the room changed. My mother stopped clapping. My father sat up straighter. Eli's smile faltered mid-expression. I didn't move. Langford didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The name said enough, the rank said more. Someone turned toward me, then another. I felt the shift as heads turned and whispers spread. I stood not to accept anything just because it felt right. Like reclaiming a shape I had to hide for too long, Langford gave me a half nod from the stage. A salute without movement. A recognition finally spoken aloud. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I simply sat back down. But the room didn't settle. Not right away. Eli looked down at me from the stage, his expression caught between confusion and disbelief. Our eyes locked. I saw him trying to calculate it, how his sister, the dropout, the delivery girl, had just been named by a general. He didn't smile again. After the final cadet crossed the stage, applause echoed across the auditorium, but I didn't clap this time. I watched my brother shake hands, pose for photos, do what was expected. And I watched my parents do the same. No one turned back toward me. But they knew. As the ceremony dispersed, Langford approached. He moved with that quiet gravity only long-time officers carry. He didn't waste words. "Wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "Neither was I." He glanced at the envelope on my lap, the folder, with my unspoken history. "You never filed for reinstatement." "No need," I said. "I got what I needed." He nodded. "You still in?" I looked at him. "Always." A pause. Then he placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. Not long, just enough to say what couldn't be said aloud. As he walked off, Eli approached. His face was tighter, now paler. "What is this?" he asked quietly. "Since when are you a colonel?" I met his eyes, the same ones that looked away when my name disappeared from family dinners, from photos, from record. "Since a long time ago," I said. "You just never noticed." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Behind him our parents watched. My father's arms were crossed, my mother's expression unreadable. I didn't give them a speech. I didn't owe them that. I walked past Eli, then paused. "You once asked if I'd ever come back?" He nodded. "I didn't," I said. "You just didn't know I never left." I stepped outside the spring sun, catching the edge of my coat. Behind me, voices continued muffled and confused, but I didn't turn around. Recognition had finally found me, and it hit like a thunderclap. The auditorium moments earlier, filled with applause and pride, now teetered on the edge of silence. You could hear a pin drop. Eli's name still echoed faintly through the PA system, but no one was paying attention to it anymore. Langford cleared his throat, his eyes still on me, and raised his voice not to the room, but to the moment. "Colonel Avery," he said, the commanding officer behind Operation Raptor. 26 lives were saved because she held her ground under fire, deep in foreign territory, under black flag clearance. A ripple moved through the audience like electricity. My parents turned toward the sound, confusion etched into every line of their faces. My father, stiff in his blazer and military pin, narrowed his eyes. My mother, who still held the program in both hands, let it fall into her lap. Their gaze followed Langford's until it landed on me. I saw the realization dawn in real time. My father's face was carved from stone, but the corners of his mouth twitched, fighting between disbelief and something dangerously close to shame. My mother's expression was harder to pin down. Her eyes widened, then welled. She looked at me as if seeing a ghost she had once known, but long buried. Eli, still on the stage, holding the trident badge in his hand, stopped mid-pose. His fingers trembled slightly. He turned to Langford as if needing confirmation, then back to me. His face cycled through a carousel of reactions: pride, confusion, panic, suspicion, and finally something like collapse. His knees didn't buckle, but I could tell it took everything to stay upright. The applause that followed Langford's announcement was hesitant, at first scattered questioning, then steadier as those in the audience started to understand. Cameras swiveled in my direction. A few officers whispered. Eli looked down at the trident still in his grip, and for a long second didn't move. My father half rose from his seat, uncertain, and managed only one phrase. "You're an Air Force colonel?" His voice cracked. It wasn't a question, it was a reckoning. "I never stopped serving," I said. That was it. Not an explanation. Not a speech. Just a fact. My mother pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Her eyes flickered with pride, but beneath it there was something else, the weight of everything she had missed, everything she had chosen not to see. Her daughter, the one they thought had walked away in disgrace, had never stopped fighting. She had simply fought where no one could see. I took a step forward. Not toward the stage, not toward them, just a single step to be seen clearly. And Eli, for the first time, truly looked at me. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Everything he had avoided thinking about for years came rushing back in those 5 seconds. His mouth opened slightly, no sound. He looked down, away, then back again. Regret started to rise in him like heat. Langford, sensing the weight of the moment, didn't interfere. He only offered a slow, respectful nod toward me. The camera still rolled, but I didn't pose. I didn't smile. I just stood there, steady and calm, while the people who once erased me tried to rewrite what they thought they knew. My mother finally stood. One hand went to my father's arm, the other pressed to her chest. "We didn't know," she whispered to no one in particular. "We didn't ask," my father replied. It wasn't an apology, but it was close. Eli stepped down from the platform, slowly, eyes not leaving mine. He passed the podium, past the other officers, and walked down the steps into the aisle. His footsteps were too loud in the quiet. He stopped 5 feet away from me, holding the trident with both hands like it was a shield or an offering. I didn't move. We stood like that in full view of everyone, and still the only things exchanged were glances and breath. When he finally found his voice, it cracked. "You're the reason I got here, aren't you?" I didn't answer. The truth didn't need to be confirmed. He already knew. His hand dropped slowly to his side. "And I'm the reason you lost everything." That one hung longer. He winced, like saying it made it real. I didn't nod. I didn't shake my head. I just stood, and after a moment, he did too. One step back, like yielding space. Langford approached again, speaking quietly to an aide beside him. I caught only part of it. Adjust the record. Add her name. My eyes didn't flicker. I wasn't here for redemption. I wasn't here for applause. I was here because my brother asked me to come, and I had. Because I was done hiding. After the reception, we were ushered into a private room just off the main hall. The lights were low. No uniforms, no crowd, just family, or what was left of that word. My mother sat near the end of a long table, her hands clenched around a folded program from the ceremony. My father stood with his back to the wall, arms crossed, face unreadable. Eli lingered near the far side of the room, shifting from foot to foot, pretending to look at the plaques on the wall. It was quiet. Then Mum looked at me, eyes rimmed red. "You were set up?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. Her lip quivered. "And you know who did it?" My silence was answer enough. I turned to Eli, and the space between us felt suddenly smaller than it had in years. "And you thought I'd stay silent forever?" I asked. His eyes widened and something inside him collapsed. He looked down, jaw tightening, breath catching. "I didn't mean to destroy everything," he said, voice cracking. I thought if you stumbled even for a second, I'd finally have a chance to stand on my own." He stepped back, his shoulders brushing the wall. "I was tired of hearing your name. Every instructor, every dinner. Dad couldn't stop reminding me of what you'd done. You were always first, always perfect. I was the one who had to catch up." My father stiffened, but didn't speak. Eli pressed on. "I got a secondary access code from a guy in our crypto module. I used it to pull a flagged file from the archives. Just one. I put it in your locker. I thought maybe it'd cause questions, not a full investigation. I didn't think they'd cut you out. I didn't think you'd vanish." I watched him. My pulse didn't spike. My fists didn't clench. Just a stillness inside me like the eye of a storm. "You thought it would just slow me down," I said flatly. "You didn't realize it would end everything." He nodded, tears now forming. I was jealous and scared and angry, but mostly I just wanted to be seen for once without being in your shadow. My mother sat frozen. My father's face was stone. Eli's voice shrank. "You disappeared, but every time your name wasn't mentioned, I felt it, like a hole in everything." I stepped closer. "You didn't just take my place. You made sure I couldn't come back. Eli sank into the chair behind him. I'm sorry, he whispered. I wake up at night hearing the sound of that door slamming shut behind you. I stared at him. My voice stayed calm. I forgive you. Not for your sake, but because I chose a mission bigger than all of this. My parents both flinched. My father finally spoke. Why didn't you tell us? I met his eyes. Because telling you wouldn't have undone what happened, and silence kept others safe. My mother's hands finally unclenched. Eli didn't look up again. I reached into my coat and laid a single paper on the table. The file, the access logs, the proof. I didn't need it anymore, but it deserved to be seen. This was never about me falling short, I said. It was about someone making sure I did. Eli looked at the page, his shoulders folded inward. I'll resign, he muttered. I shook my head. You'll serve. You'll carry that weight. But do it right. Lead better than this. The room didn't breathe for a moment. Then, finally, my mother stood and walked toward me. Her hug was awkward, stiff. But it happened. My father didn't move. But when I passed him on my way out, he gave me a single nod. That was enough. Eli didn't follow, and I didn't expect him to. I had said what needed to be said. I had heard what I needed to hear. And for the first time in years, I walked out of a room not as a shadow, but as myself. As the restaurant was modest, worn wooden tables subdued, lighting the scent of garlic and olive oil drifting from the kitchen. No fanfare, no squadron insignia, just a family trying to reclaim something that had been lost. We sat down, and my father picked up his glass of red wine. His hand shook slightly, betraying nerves I hadn't seen in years beneath his rigid exterior. He cleared his throat and said at last to Colonel Avery. The words felt heavy-earned. My mother and Eli mirrored him, lifting their own glasses. No one spoke until I joined the toast. The silence that followed was warm and real. Eli set down his knife and fork and simply looked at me directly and without reserve. That look carried something I hadn't seen in him before: respect. When the waiter placed our meals in front of us, the conversation started slowly. My brother spoke first. Dinner's perfect, he said quietly, as if measuring each word. My mother smiled, glancing between the two of us. You both look rested, she ventured. My father nodded. It's good, he added, not elaborate, but enough. I remembered the letter I'd drafted on a late night at the safe house, typed in secrecy intended to confront my family. That letter had died in my hands, torn apart because truth couldn't be shaped into words. I realized then that facing them openly in this moment mattered more than written explanations ever could. Halfway through the meal, my father lifted his glass just slightly and said, "To those who never gave up." My mother and Eli echoed it, their eyes lighting up with recognition and relief. The toast stirred something between us, a soft resetting. Eli stood carrying our plates to the side station. The act was small, but the symbolism wasn't. He was offering service instead of seeking it, a shift that spoke more than any apology could. As he washed dishes under the low sink light, my mother watched him, tears brimming again. He's growing up, she mouthed. My father's jaw softened, and he nodded once barely perceptible. I took a long sip of water. Here at this quiet table, we'd cleared more than dishes, we'd cleared space for a new story. Conversation flowed. Eli spoke of recent operations, careful to leave out classified detail. My mother asked about my team overseas. My father remarked on the family picnic next month, adding, "For the first time, I'd like you to join us." I answered with measured honesty, feeling a real answer forming in my gut. I didn't promise everything, but I promised enough. When dessert arrived, shared tiramisu, my heart felt lighter than it had in years. We ate slowly, savouring both the food and the moment. At the end, Eli quietly rose and started clearing our plates into a stack beside the sink station. I paused mid-scoop, watching him place each dish and fill the sink. He moved as though washing away years of regret with each scrub. I caught my mother's eye and she gave me a small nod. Permission, reconciliation, something unspoken and powerful. As we left the restaurant, my father opened the door and ushered us out. I felt the night air fresh against my face. Eli stopped beside me and gently patted my shoulder. No awkwardness, no distance, just acknowledgement. My mother hugged both of us and my father took my jacket for me. We walked in silence to the car, but the silence felt full, not empty. The distance among us had softened, and though the gap wasn't erased, it felt smaller. Tonight had not erased the past. It had introduced something new, willingness. A beginning. Now, 6 months later, I sat in the front row of the ceremony hall again, this time for my own promotion to Brigadier General. The air carried a formal hush, different from the last time I stood in the shadows. My family filled the seats behind me, my mother Elaine pale but steady, my father Richard, brow furrowed but present, and Eli sitting tall, his posture not perfection but pride. The 3 empty chairs I once imagined were now occupied, proof the past hadn't been forgotten, just rewritten. When the MC announced, and now Brigadier Samantha Avery Eli, rose almost before the syllables finished. His hand rose in a tentative salute, unpolished, sincere, something no words could capture. My heart clenched at the gesture, not for pride but for recognition. I turned, slowly locking eyes with him. His gaze held no performance this time. It was vulnerable and real, a brother witnessing a sister's presence, no longer a shadow. I rose to accept my new rank. The audience applause was firm, respectful. Behind me, I saw my mother dabbing her eyes, and my father rigid, but nodding in acknowledgement. As the MC fastened the rank insignia on my chest, Eli placed his hand gently, lightly on my father's shoulder, as if saying, "Yes, she belongs here." That small gesture held more truth than any speech he had believed. After the ceremony concluded, we gathered in a modest reception room. No regimented protocols, just family. My father cleared his throat and said, "I've watched enough ceremonies in my life, but this one felt different." My mother reached for my hand, her fingers trembling. "Do you hate me?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air, pressing against the silence that had lasted for years. I looked at her, her face lined with regret and hope. I squeezed her hand once. "No," I said quietly. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. She nodded, tears in her eyes, more healing than any apology. Eli took a deep breath. He began, then stopped. He looked at me and my parents and simply said, "Congratulations, Sam. It was small, but it was everything." Dinner that evening was intentional. My brother offered to cook an offering rather than an obligation. He prepared herbed chicken vegetables, and for once included my favourite dessert. We sat around the table. My father asked about my new role, and I offered just enough detail to satisfy without breaching my oath. My mother listened, smiling at my measured words, but letting the warmth show in her eyes. Eli poured wine for all of us. He handed me a glass, first then for our parents. The way he did it, steady, respectful, showed me how far he'd come. I smiled, raising my glass slightly toward him. Our eyes met, and I saw in his expression humility, relief, and pride. That night, as the final plates were cleared, Eli stood and said quietly, "I'll handle the cleanup." But this time he didn't disappear into the sink. Instead, he stayed, stacking dishes alongside my mother and me. The small act of service spoke more than any apology he could have given. Later, I sat in the passenger seat of the car as we drove home. My parents in front, Eli in back with me. My mother reached across the console and placed her hand on mine. "I love you, Sam," she said softly. I turned to her and nodded. No words needed, they felt true. Eli shifted in the back seat and spoke to me quietly. "Thank you for coming back." The sincerity in his voice struck me. I reached over the seat to squeeze his shoulder. "Thank you," I whispered, and as the car rolled toward home, I realized we had reclaimed more than a moment at a table. We had started the slow, steady process of rebuilding a family, one inclusive chair, one recognition at a time. The next morning, I walked into a small, windowless conference room deep in the headquarters. The walls were covered in mission plaques, red flag maps, commendations, ranking operations by secrecy level. A single officer sat waiting sharp, uniform, polished rank insignia. He looked at me and asked without preamble, "Major General Avery, if you had the chance to do it all over again, would you expose the person who sabotaged you?" I paused, not because I didn't have the answer, but because this question was loaded. In any other context, exposing my brother would have been the obvious moral choice. But this wasn't any other context. This was covert operations where family bonds are rarely absolute and reputations are everything. Our work depended on discretion, transparency, not to ourselves, but to the mission. I leaned forward slightly and answered softly, "No." He blinked. "Why?" I paused. I would have lost everything, including the fragile trust within our ranks. Forgiving wasn't forgetting or giving him a pass. It was choosing a path higher than retribution. I met his eyes steadily. If not for that fall, I would never have become what I am. I learned to rise without applause, to protect what matters in silence. That was the lesson. He nodded slowly, then gestured for the session to end. I stood, shook his hand, and walked out with the same calm certainty I brought into the room. Outside the door, I passed the old roll of honor used during my training days, names carved into bronze. I looked for Avery Samantha, but it wasn't there. Not surprising and not important. I offered a quiet smile. My worth wasn't in that list. Back in my office, across from classified dossiers and mission maps, a small envelope waited on my desk. No return address. Inside was a glossy photograph of two young women in uniform on their academy's first day, Eli and me smiling at the camera. On the back, in Eli's neat script, "Hoping you have a reason to hang this again." I traced the handwriting. My chest tightened, then relaxed. It was more than a letter. It was acknowledgement, unspoken for years. I took the photo and pinned it above my clearance wall next to a single phrase scrawled in ink in the shadows, but never gone. Weeks later, intelligence reports confirmed that Eli had quietly resigned his commission. No fanfare, no statements. Just a brief note, retired SEAL. Served well. I didn't reach out. Some bridges rebuild themselves with time. Now, as I walk through the corridors of the base, uniform, crisp, call-sign official, I see his letter above the wall. I see my own reflection in the glass frames. I see the woman who lost everything and regained it on her own terms. This is the end of one mission and the beginning of another. My name won't appear on every wall. My picture won't fill headline slots. But every operation I lead, every life secured, every secret kept, that's who I am. I step outside into the midday sun, feeling the weight of what I've earned quietly, invisibly. And with that, I walk on to whatever comes next. The sky is impossibly blue, the kind of clear that doesn't lie. I breathe it in and let it sit. For years, I thought healing would come with applause, or a headline, or someone saying, "You were right." Turns out it came in smaller things, a folded photo, a hand on my shoulder, a room where I no longer had to shrink myself to fit. There are people like me everywhere. People who've been cut out of their own stories, who sat through dinners, with names missing, achievements forgotten. People who carry silence like armor, because explaining the truth felt heavier than living with the lie. If that's you, I see you. Not with sympathy, but with recognition. The kind that doesn't need words. I don't have answers for all of it, but I've learned this sometimes justice doesn't look like a reversal. Sometimes it looks like resilience, like staying upright, like building a life that makes sense to you, even if no one else claps. And if you've made it this far, maybe you know that too. So if any part of this story held a mirror to yours, if you've ever been overlooked, misunderstood, or written off, know that it's not the end. You're not alone. You're not broken. And you're not invisible, not really. If you need the reminder, come back. Stay a while. Subscribe if you want. Not because I need the numbers, but because maybe you need a place where the unseen are finally seen.